This is a good crowd today. Glad to see you all. My name is John Baza. I'm the director of the Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining. And this is our quarterly collaborative meeting, about 2 weeks late. But welcome to all of you. Hopefully you'll be informed and educated with a few things that are going on with the oil and gas industry today. Got a pretty good program set up for you. And I just wanted to acknowledge that John Rogers, who normally kicks off these meetings, is under the weather, so he couldn't make it out for this meeting. That's why I'm starting this out. But I'll turn some time over to Bart Kettle in just a minute, and he'll basically coordinate the rest of the program today. I did want to acknowledge that the morning refreshments that you're enjoying are courtesy of Duchesne County, so thank you to them. Thank you for letting us be in this facility. It's always a wonderful place to hold a meeting, and we appreciate the ability to use this facility for this purpose. We do have lunch that is going to be provided today, and that is being sponsored by Finley Resources, Inc. and Uinta Wax Operating LLC. So we also appreciate them for their hosting of our lunch today. I'm not going to belabor this any further, and I'll turn time over to Bart Kettle, who is the Deputy Director in our Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining, and he'll cover the rest of the program. So thanks.
Okay, thank you, John. Continuing along the line of just kind of giving a couple people a little bit of thanks for the work they're doing. With any event, there's almost always a few people behind the scenes that we don't really see that make this possible. So I'd like to give a shout out today to the Duchesne County Event Center staff. So that's Jerry Lisenby and his staff, Amy, Cody, Danny, and Melissa. So if you see Jerry or when you're back from morning break, please take just a moment to thank them. They're the ones that organize the morning snacks. They're the ones that organize all the lunch stuff behind the scenes. So if you can, just take a moment to thank them. So getting started today, activity as far as oil and gas activity in the state's up a little bit. Our production in the state has been increasing the last year. We've actually seen the volume of natural gas produced in the state stabilize and maybe even increase a little bit the last 12 months, which is kind of an interesting trend because it's been decreasing for quite some time. On my way over here, coming from Price, Utah this morning, I definitely followed several trucks and seen multiple more transporting oil over 191 into Price to put it on the rail. So things are getting a little busy. And a big part of that we feel like is air quality in the basin. It affects everything we do. So today's collaborative is kind of centered around that. Hopefully we can use this collaborative as just that, a chance to both gain knowledge here and then also collaborate with the people and find solutions to the hard problems we're all facing. So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to the first speaker, which is Dr. Seth Lyman with USU, and I'll let him take it away.
Can I do that? There we go. Okay, thank you. Thanks for inviting me to speak here. And I first want to give maybe a disclaimer or an apology. Some of the slides, some of the information is similar to what I presented on at the Energy Summit in Vernal a while ago. And so if there's repeat, then I won't be offended if you go to sleep or whatever. I wanted to talk about kind of the trends in air quality and some of my thoughts about what we can do to keep that going, even as oil and gas production in the Uinta Basin increases. First, just so you know who we are, USU, the main campus is in Logan, and even though we've been at this for about 11 years, then people still think we're in Logan. We work at the Vernal campus of USU right here in the Uinta Basin. We have 4 PhD scientists, research tech, and some students who work with us. We focus on just environmental issues related to energy development. Air quality in the Uinta Basin is probably the biggest part of that, though. Just a quick, what our purpose is to do academic research, but with kind of the goal of providing information that stakeholders, so folks in industry and government and whoever else wants to use it, can use to benefit the state. So the work we do a lot of air quality measurements, a lot of emissions measurements, but not in the realm of compliance. Everything that we do that's specific to specific locations is anonymized so that there's not any issues related to that. Our purpose is to provide information for others to use. We do a lot of air quality monitoring and modeling, so to understand what's going on in the atmosphere. We do a lot of emissions measurements, especially from the industry. We have a comprehensive environmental lab, and we also do rangeland restoration work. Colleen Jones, who's in that picture, is the one who leads that. Okay, now more again, so some of this is review. Maybe this is review for everybody, just so you know. So what I'm talking about is ozone in the wintertime in the Uinta Basin. And ozone isn't emitted from sources. Instead, organic compounds, or VOC, and oxides of nitrogen, or NOx, are emitted from sources. They react in the air. Sunlight is the energy that allows those reactions to happen and make ozone. And then ozone can impact health and is regulated by the EPA. And then you probably already know, but high ozone, just so we're all on the same page, high ozone is usually found in urban areas in the summer. Here in the Uinta Basin and the Evergreen, and someone pointed out to me that in 2021 there was one high ozone day when there was snow on the ground in Denver in 2021. So, but that it's pretty rare there, and actually is increasingly rare in the Evergreen, and as I'll show you, more rare here in the Uinta Basin as well. But these are the areas where winter ozone is found, and pretty much the only area in the world where it's found. And what makes us unique is that we are low enough latitude and high enough altitude to have pretty persistent snow cover in the winter, and also to have enough sun, but still have enough sunlight for those chemical reactions in the atmosphere to form. So winter ozone is going to be less and less likely the further north you go, because the sun is dimmer in the winter, and less likely the further south you go, because there's less likely to be snow cover on the ground. These two areas, because we have mountains on all sides, have really strong temperature inversions. Also, that's the meteorological side. The emissions side is that the two areas have relatively high emissions of organics from oil and gas. And that turns out to be important because the chemistry that makes ozone kind of shuts down in the winter, and the relatively high organics emissions kind of push it forward and allow it to happen, whereas otherwise it wouldn't. That's why there's not high ozone in the wintertime, say in Salt Lake City. Instead, there's high haze, that PM 2.5 or particulate matter haze that you see there, and actually really low ozone in the winter in Salt Lake because they don't have the right emissions to allow for that chemistry. So that's kind of the background about why our area is unique and kind of what's going on here. You probably also know that the EPA designated the Uinta Basin as a non-attainment area in 2018. The red line is the boundaries of that non-attainment area. But even when that designation happened and before, ozone has been declining in the Uinta Basin. This is from a paper my coworker Mark Mansfield wrote, showing the number of ozone exceedance days. So the EPA standard is 70 parts per billion as an 8-hour average on a given day. And so the count here is the number of days in a given winter, and this is specific to the ORE monitoring station, that exceed that 70 ppb level. You'll see the red dots on there. Those are winters where we didn't have much snow. So without much snow, then there's not ozone formation. So we're only worried about the blue dots, and you can see a strong decline since measurements began in December 2009. So I thought I'd talk a little about why that has happened, at least what we know, why winter ozone has been declining. I'm not going to explain this one for the sake of time, but just know what this is showing us is that we know that decline is not from meteorology. There are meteorological changes year to year. The decline is what my coworker did is use statistical methods to kind of factor out the influence of meteorology, and we still see a decline in winter ozone. So we know it has to do with emissions. And a fellow, John Lynn, at the University of Utah, published a paper that I was a co-author on, showing that methane emissions in the Uinta Basin have declined as well, and that's what this is showing. So what John did, I don't know if there's a pointer, and you guys over there maybe can't see it if I use the pointer anyway. So can you see? Yeah, you can see that though, can't you? Oh, but I went backwards. So in 2013, a group from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration did an aircraft study and showed high emissions, relatively high emissions of methane in the Uinta Basin. The triangle there is their average, but there's big error bars on their measurement. Got to be careful there. And then John what he did is took measurements of methane at our research station at Horse Pool. You can see it's in the center of Uinta County there. And he used a meteorological model that to show kind of where the air came from before it reached our Horse Pool site. And then he made projections about what methane emissions would have had to be to get to the concentrations of methane that we measured at the site. So this kind of gray blob shows the air or the air shed that influenced the measurements there. And as it gets darker, that's where there's more influence. So you can see this decline is strongly influenced by Uinta County, less influenced by Duchesne County. And as you know, Uinta County has more gas production. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But at least in the eastern Uinta Basin, there's been a strong decline in methane emissions, and we think a strong decline in other organics. Methane actually isn't very reactive, so it doesn't do very much to make winter ozone. It's the other non-methane organic compounds that are important for winter ozone, but of course they're emitted together more or less into the atmosphere. And also NOx emissions, the other half of what makes winter ozone, have been declining. So there's a few ways that we've looked at this. My coworker, Lee G. David, though, has done work on this looking at satellite data. So there are satellites that measure the NO2, at least, part of NOx, the majority of NOx, from the satellite and take daily measurements. And so she did averages of those measurements, and the squares here are like the grid cell size of the satellite. And you'd think plus means an increase, plus means statistical significance in this figure. But as you go towards cooler colors, then you have a stronger decrease in NOx in this picture. So especially in the central Uinta Basin, where I just showed there's been a decline in methane, that's where there's the strongest decline in NOx, a lesser decline in the western basin. So we see this several different ways that not just ozone is declining, but the chemicals that lead to ozone production in the atmosphere are declining also. So that means emissions of ozone-forming compounds have been declining. So I made this graphic, and I'm nervous to show it because it comes from the DOGM website, and I made a projection for 2022. So what this shows is oil and gas production, annual oil and gas production that I took from the DOGM website from 1990 to the present. And you can see the natural gas went up and then declined a lot. And then what I did for 2022, as far as I could tell from the website, then so it shows 2022 data, and it says it's only through the current year, or the most recent completed month. And from what I could tell, that was July. So I multiplied it by 12 divided by 7 to assume the production will stay the same for the rest of the year. So we don't know, but if we go by that, then there's a pretty decent increase in natural gas production for 2022 and a pretty large increase, I think, of oil production. You were nodding, Bart. That's okay? Okay. So I didn't totally screw it up. So we think things are going back in the other direction. The trick, as far as production goes, the trick is, though, that all of these declines that we've been looking at statistically were happening, of course, before this increase in production. And we think, especially since the declines seem to be stronger in the eastern Uinta Basin, where most of the natural gas production happens, some portion of that is due to just the decline in natural gas production in the basin. Does that make sense? So what I want to bring out is, as natural gas and oil production increase again in the Uinta Basin, there's a potential for a reversal of this air quality trend. It doesn't mean for sure that's going to happen, but there's that potential, and that's kind of what I want to bring out. So this is the same data, oil production in blue, natural gas production in red over years, but I zoomed into the years 2010 to 2022. And I want to point out, I think there's There's some evidence in our data. It's circumstantial a little bit, though, and we don't need to go into the details of that, that not all of the decline is due to just a decline in production. And there's a few reasons, or a few things that have happened over that period of the decline that I think are worth noting. One is some EPA rules that require emissions reductions, especially for organics, and Utah Division of Air Quality passed rules to comply with this, and in some cases go a little farther. And then also we did, and so the squares are kind of when those rules were implemented or came into play. And then we also did a couple of studies looking at emissions with FLIR cameras or optical glass imaging cameras, looking at where emissions are coming from in the Uinta Basin from oil and gas wells. And we did some surveys to companies to ask what they were doing as far as leak detection and repair and other things. And in our study, we showed it in a couple of different ways that a lot of companies are doing things above and beyond what's regulatorily required by EPA and Utah Division of Air Quality. So this square is just when we did those studies to show that that was the case. Probably that started before, and I know that that's continuing. So there's a combination of a decline in natural gas production and an increase in kind of activities that reduce emissions. We don't have a good way to quantify how much was from the decline in production, how much of this decrease, or we should say improvement in air quality was because of a decline in production, how much was because of changes in how the industry operates. But we know it's a combination of both. Okay, and I don't want to steal Sheila's thunder about the regulatory side, but forgive me if I steal a little bit of the thunder. But so this is the same figure from our paper. They give you, for seeing whether you're in attainment of the standard, EPA takes a 3-year average. Sheila maybe will explain in more detail about that. I went the wrong way. But the years they were supposed to use is 2018, 2019, 2020 to see if we attained the standard and could go out of this non-attainment designation we were in. 2019 was a high year, and so that 3-year average was too high, and we should have been declared out of attainment. The Utah Division of Air Quality submitted a request to EPA to give an extension, which basically kind of kicks that 3-year can down the road, and they did that twice. EPA approved the first one. I don't know about the second one. Maybe Sheila will have news about that. But if you add in these other 2 years, 2021 and 2022, so as that can kicks down the road, now we have 3 years that have low ozone and are at least eligible for coming into attainment of the standard. Or maybe Sheila will have more news about that. But so things have continued to look good these last few years. And so what I want to point out there is just kind of maybe we're on a roll. We're going in the right direction as far as air quality, and hopefully that gives us motivation to continue that trend. With that said, though, could we still get a nasty high ozone winter? We definitely could. It's not time to stop worrying about it. This is a figure that will be in our annual report that'll come out later this month. This is data from our horse pool station. So this is just a research site, not a regulatory site. But we measure snow depth there. You can see there wasn't much snow this past winter. There was some snow early, and then it melted out through most of the basin, and then a storm brought snow in the end of February. And then an inversion event came. That's kind of the light blue box. It's when the inversion event was. I measured total UV radiation. That's how much comes in and how much reflects off the snow, because both matter for making ozone. Both provide energy for making ozone. And then the green trace, you can see that ozone rapidly jumped up. But if you look at the snow was melting over that time. So ozone was building. It was ready to form. Luckily, the snow melted out at the same time and kept this high ozone trend from continuing during that period. So if the meteorology happened to be different that winter, if we had deeper snow that took longer to melt, or the air was a few degrees colder to keep that snow on the ground longer, things could have looked a lot worse. So the reason I point that out is, again, my purpose is to say we're going in the right direction. We're not out of the woods yet. There's plenty of work that needs to be done to make sure that we keep this trend going. So I have a few ideas about that based on research that we've done, and now I hope to not steal the Utah Petroleum Association's thunder, and I'll leave plenty for them to explain. The first thing that I want to talk about, this is just conceptual, but my coworker Mark Mansfield has been doing a lot of box modeling and looking at what would be more effective, emissions reductions of organic compounds or emissions reductions of NOx. And both are emitted from the oil and gas industry and other sources, but sometimes it's a good idea to look at things like this, because it could be that the way ozone formation happens is the chemistry is complicated in the atmosphere. So sometimes removing NOx emissions, which come from any kind of combustion or burning, is not as effective as removing VOC emissions or reducing VOC emissions, which in the oil and gas industry are mostly leaks or emissions from tanks and things like that. So it's useful to look at which one would be more effective. What you can see here, so my y-axis here is the effectiveness of emission reduction. So the higher you are, it means the more effective it would be to reduce that type of emissions, if this makes sense. And the lower you are, it means it's less effective. And if you go below 0, it means that reducing emissions of that compound or compound group would make things worse. So you can see early in the winter, reducing emissions of NOx won't help and might make things a tiny bit worse. Probably not enough worse to matter. The reason that can happen is, again, the chemistry is complicated. So NOx can actually eat up ozone in some conditions and make ozone in other conditions. So it looks like in early winter, NOx is just a little bit eating up ozone. So reducing emissions of NOx aren't going to help. As we move later in the winter, then they reach parity. So emissions reductions of organics or NOx would both help. Almost all of our, especially now that it's harder for ozone to form, ozone usually can't form until we get a little later in the winter when there's more sunlight. So it's really around this period that we need to worry about, into February, especially the second half of February towards the 1st of March. So what we think is that any emissions reductions will be useful. If we reduce NOx and it makes ozone a tiny bit worse in early winter, it's probably not going to matter because ozone almost never forms in early winter. Just reducing all emissions is the best thing that we can do. Hopefully that makes sense, what I talk about there. Okay, so with that in mind, I have 4 quick ideas that I think are already helping and will continue to help. One is we can focus on the winter. There's things we can do just in the winter time, and that has to do with the Latch the Hatch program, and UPA is going to talk more about that. That could be extra LDAR. I know a lot of companies are doing aerial surveys. This is a stock image from Bridger Photonics that does aerial surveys. So there are things just in the winter season. We also do, as some of you know, an ozone alert program. That just means that we send emails out to whoever signs up for our email list when we think high ozone is going to form. And so that way companies can reduce emissions when it matters and help ozone not to form. What we're going to do this winter is send semi-weekly updates all winter by email. So every other week we'll say, hey, it's looking good, or there's snow on the ground, it could go bad, or whatever, right? And then we'll send kind of a speculative email about 6 days out, like before we think ozone could form. Like, so if snow is going to fall and things are going to stay cold. And then we'll send a follow-up email 1 to 2 days before an ozone event to say, yeah, for sure it's going to come, or no, it looks like the snow melted out, or something like that. And then after an ozone episode, we'll let people know on the email list, you're in the clear now, or whatever. So if you want to sign up for that, all you got to do is send me an email. We have a website with a form. It just goes to my email anyway, so just send me an email. So there's things we can do that, like just for the winter season, or even a lot of years, just for a few days, or just for a couple of weeks, that will make a huge difference. So that's one. Another thing is electrify if possible. I know that might be prohibitively expensive in a lot of the basin, but some places it's not. So we've done a study recently showing that natural gas fueled engines emit some NOx and actually a lot of organics. They tend to be fairly inefficient and pass a lot of fuel in the exhaust. So if that's possible to replace them, that's great. Even where you can't get line power, then solar-powered electrical pumps instead of pneumatic pumps or no-bleed pneumatics are awesome, and I think some companies have shown they're cost-effective, and so that's actually a big part of the organics emissions picture in the Uinta Basin is pneumatics. and maybe where there's line power, then electric heaters could replace natural gas fueled heaters. Okay, my third idea is reducing surface exposure of oil and gas waste. So instead of land farming, that's what this is a picture of, we can landfill so that the oil and gas solid waste is covered. And produced water, open ponds, are not a huge part of organics emissions in the Uinta Basin, but a meaningful part. And by injecting that water, or maybe I know at least in Colorado, some companies have covered some ponds and then put a little bit of negative pressure under those covers and route it to a flare. It makes a big difference. I know here there's kind of a trend towards reusing that water for fracking. That's awesome for water savings. It's less good for air quality when there are big open ponds, because those ponds the water is rich in organics, and those organics get into the air. So there's another idea. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is we can improve capture of tank emissions, especially where there's combustors, and that's part of the UPA's Latch the Hatch program. But I wanted to just bring out one example from a study we did. So what we did is we did a lot of FLIR camera surveys of thousands of oil and gas wells in the Uinta Basin. We did some in 2016 and more in 2018. And one company that I'll call Company F, in 2016, had quite a few emission plumes on their well pads, and most of these are coming from tanks. And we did this all from off pad, so we're only seeing the somewhat larger plumes. And so in our first survey, what we saw is that company had more than half of their wells had emission plumes that we could see from off pad. In 2018, when we came back, it was only 0.13 wells plumes per pad. So they had dramatically improved. And we talked to that company, and this is the list of what they did. A lot of their thief hatches the pressure rating was too low for the pressure on the tank. So they replaced their thief hatches with ones that could handle a higher pressure. They installed better hatch seals. If I remember correctly, it was fluoropolymer seals that do a better job at sealing for a longer time. They installed a single pressure relief outlet, so there was a pressure relief valve, like an Inardo valve, that was at slightly lower pressure rating than the thief hatch. So if they did blow out the tank because of too high a pressure, it would open that valve and leave the hatch in place so that the hatch opened less often and stayed sealed. And then they started an aggressive leak detection and repair program with dedicated employees, and those things together seem to have made a big change. So my point there is that I think there's solid data, that there's kind of low-hanging fruit things that we can do to help with improving air quality in the Uinta Basin. And that's all I got, thanks to funders and others who help us.
Is there a question?
Go ahead.
Hello. Thanks, Dr. Lyman. Could you go back to that slide that showed effectiveness of reducing organics and NOx?
Oh, sure.
So I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So if I look at the curve, is effectiveness mean that those things don't produce ozone if you can reduce them? And what does effectiveness mean?
So what this means is if you reduce VOC by a given percent, you reduce NOx by a given percent. So higher means a percent reduction in organics emissions leads to a higher percent reduction in ozone formation. Does that make sense? So the reason this mostly the reason this happens is that we get more sunlight later, and that changes the air chemistry. And so it changes it so a little bit of NOx goes a longer way later in the winter. Does it make sense what I'm saying?
So the two curves seem to converge around 0.7.
Yeah, that's
so
right.
You say that they reach parity at that point.
Yeah, so a similar, if you reduce NOx by 1% or organics by 1%, you get the same outcome in terms of ozone reduction by the time they come match in early spring, late winter.
Well, thanks for clarifying.
Does that make sense? Yeah. So when we look at this, it looks like probably overall reducing emissions of organics as a percentage will be more effective compared to NOx, but it's not always as easy to reduce. Maybe there's opportunities to easily or cheaply reduce emissions of one or the other, and that probably matters more than the percent effectiveness, right? We're going to do what we can do instead of like spending $1 trillion to reduce NOx by 1% when we could reduce VOC by 1% for $1,000, right? And so that's why I say probably just the take-home message is if we can reduce either one, that's good, right? Any other questions? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Doc.
Thank you, Dr. Lyman. Real quick, while we're getting ready for the next presentation, we've got to do a computer switch. So if you get a chance to talk to all the presenters today, maybe thank them for their time. They get a pretty generous payment for coming here. They get lunch and morning snacks just like everybody else. So they come and prepare and speak and go through all the nerves for basically the same thing we all get in the audience.
All right. Good morning, everyone. It's good to be here. I'm Sheila Vance. I'm with the Utah Division of Air Quality. I'm in environmental science. Been with them for about 6 years now, and I work in the policy and planning section there. So we deal with the different pollutants that we have here in Utah, and I have focused on the Uinta Basin. Okay. And ozone in particular over the last few years. So I'm just going to provide a bit of a regulatory update on where we're at in terms of regulations. And thank you, Seth. That was a good kind of background, and hopefully I can share some news, but not much as usual. But we do have 3 non-attainment areas for ozone here in Utah. And we have the Wasatch Front is divided into 2 different non-attainment areas, and then the Uinta Basin. And as you can see, the Wasatch Front's kind of divided by county. In the Uinta Basin, we actually went with an elevation attainment area as, surprisingly, I think there's one other place in the United States that has a non-attainment area based upon elevation. But because when we see the inversion set in, not only do things not go out, things don't come in. So basically, we used an elevation, and EPA did designate us with that. So where we're at currently, the Wasatch Front, our southern Wasatch Front, so the Utah County area has actually attained the standard, and we'll be heading towards maintenance. The Wasatch Front just recently was formally upgraded, classified to moderate. So we're actually actively working on a state implementation plan that needs to be turned into EPA next year on how we're going to attain the standard on the Wasatch Front. And as Seth mentioned, the Uinta Basin's a little unique. They were the only area in the nation that was approved a 1-year extension for the attainment date. So we didn't attain by our original one, but we have met those extension requirements, and we have sent in a second 1-year extension. And in discussions with EPA, it appears they are planning on approving it. But what they're kind of waiting for is the end of this year, because if they give us the extension, our attainment date becomes August of 2023. So this year will still be utilized in how they determine attainment of that standard. So I think they're kind of waiting to see what happens with this year, and potentially what they will do then in the spring of 23 is approve our second 1-year extension and actually make a determination that we made the attainment date by clean data. So as I said, we're expecting to see that extension. Our current design value, so we use 3 years of ozone data from a monitor, and we take the 4th highest value and average it over 3 years. So currently using 2020, 2021 and current 2022 data, the monitors here in the basin sit around 67 parts per billion, and 70 parts per billion is the number we do not want to exceed. So I did some basic math. Hopefully I did it okay. But basically that means we can't have our monitors, and I think it's the Ouray monitor and the Roosevelt monitor. If we see anything 73 or above, we will not make the standard for 23. So that's not much. We have seen high ozone in December. I looked back through the data. I think it was 2009, 2010, 2013. And actually, we did see an exceedance once on December 31st. So it's kind of a calendar game at this point. But if we do get a 75 on December 31st, we'll not attain the standard. So I appreciate what Seth has mentioned, and I'm looking forward to the discussion with the Utah Petroleum Association and all of you, because I do think any efforts we can make, especially if we start to see, I mean, even driving up here today, it's cold, there's a little frost on the ground, got some early snow. We got early snow last year, and then it went away. But if we do start to see cold, snow, there is a potential for us to exceed in December. And then hopefully we are able to work through this year. We will then go into maintenance for the basin, and we will need to put a maintenance plan together at the state level of how we're going to maintain that standard and send that to EPA and request to be redesignated as attainment. So again, even if we do attain the standard, there's still work to be done because we need to maintain that standard. And as you all know, there's a lot of growth happening right now in the basin. So I always like to kind of show this slide. There's a lot of complexities to the basin, a lot of agencies out here. So this is kind of a complicated slide, but the pink outline is actually the reservation. The yellow is the non-attainment area. So it kind of fits in there. And then the blue and the red or maroon, blue being oil, the maroon being gas wells. So as Seth was mentioning, you can see there's kind of a divide of where the oil is and where the natural gas production is. 75-80% of the emissions are actually on Indian country and regulated by the tribe and EPA. And about 20% of the emissions fall under Utah Division of Air Quality's jurisdiction. So it's really important that we all work together here in the basin more than anywhere else. And that makes it a little challenging also for folks who want to work and produce here, is having different regulatory agencies. And we aim to not have different standards, but that can be difficult. Also interesting enough, and I use a 2017 inventory because if we do have to write a plan for attainment, this would be what we would call our base year inventory. So this is where everything would work from. And so as you can see here, our NOx mainly come from EGUs, which are energy generating units, Bonanza, basically. And then oil and gas is behind there. And then actually mobile sources for our NOx sources here in the basin. VOC sources, pretty obviously, are oil and gas. Not a lot of other VOC sources here in the basin. And this will be hard to see, and I'll share these, obviously, and you guys can take a closer look. But we kind of tried to look at dividing it even more so into NOx and VOCs. The interesting part for VOCs are, from a state perspective, this is all VOC sources, but if I divided this between state and EPA, it becomes a little more obvious. But for us, oil tanks are basically our largest VOC source. And then engines. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about engines later. But on EPA's side, it actually is ponds become their largest VOC source. So from an agency perspective, we kind of have to attack the sources a little differently from a regulation standard. And so as we continue to move forward, it's really important to understand the emission sources and where we can best put our energy to control those sources effectively rather than waste our time controlling something that won't be as effective. So rulemaking for us in Utah, we did just recently go through a rulemaking effort. The big topic of that was actually tank controls. We did some studies out here looking at VOCs from tanks, and we have a threshold for when you need to control your tanks and when you don't need to equate to 4 tons per year. And we try to equate that to a throughput value just to make it easier to comply, hopefully. So we were going to lower that. We proposed to lower that standard from 8,000 barrels a year to 3,200. That did not pass. There's been a lot of discussion on how to determine those emissions from the tanks. And we haven't all come to quite to agreement on how to do that. So I believe that was kind of the crux of why that did not get passed. Some other parts of the rule did, AO exclusions, but that's kind of in the weeds there. So we're currently anticipating working with industry on how do we pull a sample and how do we evaluate that sample and how do we model emissions from tanks. And it's a pretty complex process, and we're getting more and more data. We appreciate industry has said that they're willing to share a lot of the data they've been collecting recently. Our VOC composition study was the basis for our rulemaking, which was about 50 tanks, which isn't a lot. So now we're hoping we'll get a lot more data and sit down together and hopefully come up with a good solution. But I do anticipate we will still go back because I do believe that the current throughput value is a little high for the 4 tons per year requirement we have. So anticipate hopefully in 2023 coming back with that rulemaking. Pump jack engines. So there's been some studies recently in the basin. The legislature money that we get every year for air quality research. We did provide some to Seth's group at USU, and they did a study on pump jack engines. EPA has also come out and done some testing for compliance reasons. And basically, these studies strongly indicate that there's much higher VOC emissions from these than we have reflected in our inventory. And actually, interestingly enough, reactive VOCs also, so not just the small chain hydrocarbons, the larger ones that are more complex and actually more reactive to form ozone. And interestingly enough, lower NOx. Well, I guess not interesting enough. I think that's kind of how the engines are set up here. But so it comes down to there's about 2,200 of these two-stroke lean burn engines, and these are where we see the highest VOCs and also actually CO. So we are currently taking that data, we're updating our inventories with this data, and we will present that to stakeholders here. I'm hoping before the end of the year, where we'll reflect this data in our actual inventory, and then we can start talking about what can we do. But ultimately, right now, the early numbers, it's about 20% of our VOCs in the basin are represented by these engines. And also, I know some of the numbers almost indicate some of these engines are almost 100 tons of VOC a year, which would make them a major source alone, just an engine. So I think there's some work to be done. Hopefully, we know we can't get rid of them all, but hopefully we will work together on some solutions to hopefully make them emit less or operate more efficiently. And that's, again, a goal of ours for 2023. So as part of that, we also had received a targeted airshed grant from EPA about 4 years ago, actually, $5 million. We're kind of running out of time on it because we haven't spent any money on it yet. I think when we proposed the grant, we didn't fully understand how this could work. But we are working with EPA right now to refine our scope of work for that grant, which would then allow what we're seeing, and Seth mentioned, is electrification. If there's a way to replace some of these natural gas engines with an electric motor, this grant could fund that, up to 40% of the projected costs. And just some kind of little bit of details, you would have to scrap that engine if you did replace it with a cleaner, newer engine. But ultimately, $5 million, and I think we'll see what happens with the Inflation Reduction Act, but there is a lot of money coming to EPA and then being tunneled down through the states, and a lot of that is focused on methane and those kind of pollutants. So hopefully there'll be some more opportunities for grants and help in the basin, because I do think the electrification would be a huge help in terms of emissions here. We will announce it. We're hoping to open applications early in 2023, and we'll do some outreach at that time. And you can talk to me about it, or Courtney Ehrlich in our office is our grant coordinator for this. But like I said, we'll do more outreach once we get, hopefully, the application open and online. So just lastly, just our regulatory path forward. Again, I think our biggest priority right now is a common path and a common ground for how do we estimate tank emissions. Everything starts there. That determines controls. And not only for Utah state rules, but for EPA rules. There is a federal implementation plan that has been imminent for years, but our understanding is it's hopefully imminent in weeks. I don't know. But that FIP is going to have a significant impact here in the basin, as it does also lower the standard for tanks to 4 tons per year when you would need controls. And that's not only for new, but also existing sources. And then again, as I mentioned, the data for engines, looking at that, hopefully working with stakeholders, what can we do to make these run a little better? And they are a really significant source, it's looking like. And once we finish our modeling of the Wasatch Front, we are going to go back to looking at the photochemical model for the basin to help us understand, assess a little chart of the NOx and the VOCs. Hopefully the modeling will help us understand better how we could effectively control emissions to reduce ozone. And ultimately, hopefully we will be developing a maintenance plan rather than a moderate SIP next year. And how do we maintain the standard? What can we do to make sure we don't go back into non-attainment? And that is all I have today. So any questions?
One moment.
Do I know anything about the permitting process for injection wells?
I know we have some operators that are, they've increased the amount of APDs we're getting on injection wells to dispose of the water instead of putting it in a pond. But some of them are having problems getting their permits. Do you know what the guidelines are?
Is it permits through air quality?
Through the EPA for the disposal permit.
Oh, yeah, that I am not familiar with. I apologize.
I'll speak on that just really briefly. I hope I can answer your question. So, can you show your map of the basin?
Oh, sure.
So one of the things about the basin that those of us that kind of work in it, we sort of accept what it is, and I think we sometimes forget like how complicated the land ownership and the various jurisdictions in the basin are. They're really complicated. They're probably, when you look at like the various oversight from federal, state, and you look at mineral and split estate, it's probably as complex of a scenario as you're going to find. Like every element is sort of here in the Uinta Basin. So the reason I asked Sheila to show that map is it shows some of the same things that will affect permitting of UIC wells, and that being the boundaries that fall within Indian country, and then also the private or state lands versus the federal lands. And so you have two different groups that permit UIC wells here in the basin. So if it's wells that fall outside of conventional Indian country, and it's a little more complicated than the map Sheila has there, but that would be the Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining. If they fall within Indian country, then it would be the EPA. And this is not absolute, but for practical purposes, most of Uinta County will fall within the Indian country designation, and Duchesne County is a little bit split. So I'm not sure if that answers your question or not.
Somewhat. I know one of our operators had one of their permits denied, and I just
Okay, and the question is, a permit denied, who had jurisdiction and why? If it falls within Indian country, it would be within EPA. Yeah, I can't answer that on a specific basis, but.
Good question. Any other questions for me? Oh, yes.
Can you explain to this group what it will mean if we get slapped into non-attainment status?
Yes. So if we do not attain with our extensions, what that means is we'll be moved up to a moderate classification. We're in a marginal classification, and that has the least amount of kind of regulatory requirements for it. If we move up to moderate, other things start to happen. And what that means is we have to start looking at control technologies that are out there, and we have to implement what is called RACT and RACM. So you have to look at all the reasonable available control technologies out there for your sources and evaluate, are you doing enough reasonable activities to attain the standard? Which a lot of what we do already meets that. A lot of what we do actually meets BACT, which is the next level, best available control technologies. What the biggest impact for the basin would be is a 15% reduction in VOCs is a mandatory requirement for a moderate area. So we would have to start looking for where can we get that reduction of 15% of our VOCs. And that starts to become hard. And that's where we would have to start looking at more controls. Honestly, the engines would be the easiest place for us to look right now. But again, how do we implement and fix it in a reasonable manner would be tough. It would extend. Oh, this is actually interesting. I don't know if we got bumped up, would it move our non-attainment area date to 24, Becky? Or I know, I don't know exactly because we have the 2-year extension. No, it wouldn't. So we would have to attain the standard by 24, which if we get high ozone this December, chances are we wouldn't attain in a year. So that would mean we'd be then bumped up to serious, which is what the Wasatch Front is looking at. And that becomes a little harder because now like major sources go from 100 tons per year to 50. So that brings a lot more sources under the rules to where we would have to evaluate folks' permits, put more controls on. So yeah, it becomes, just things become a little bit tighter, and we will have to continue to look at how can we control our VOCs and NOx out here and attain the standard. So it just becomes a little more, and now we're on timelines, and now there's basically the biggest hammer the Clean Air Act has is federal highway funding starts to become restricted, and those kind of things happen. So it's pretty important not only for folks' health, obviously, this is a health standard, and we want to make sure, even if it is just in the winter time, we have seen some of the highest ozone in the nation here, and it does have an impact on folks' health. So we want to protect people's health, but we also don't want to make this more complex regulatory-wise because it does become a little challenging as EPA and the tribe have different time frames than the state. We have times and things we have to do to meet, and it's a little hard because our impact with 20% of the emissions under our regulatory authority, we have a harder time making an impact on ozone than, say, EPA or the tribe do in terms of regulation. So that would be another challenging part of being bumped up. So hopefully that kind of helps you see the importance of this December. And we're all hoping, I mean, you know, we need to address the ozone issue and we need to protect folks' health, but it'll be nice if we can do it in a manner that's not prescriptive. So we don't get caught up in regulatory timelines and prescriptive things we have to do. I'd rather us work on good solutions together that will actually have an impact and make sense. So.
I have a question. Could you talk or touch on international contributions to our ozone problem? what percentage is that growing? What does that look like as far as VOCs that are other contributing parts of the region or international?
Yeah, and I don't know if Seth could help me a little bit on it says you're like, don't ask me. But I know initially my thoughts are there really isn't a contribution internationally here because of the basin, and when we get an inversion here, it's all very self-producing. I don't know if you'd like to add something. Thank you, Seth.
If you want me to.
Yes.
So in the summer, the picture is very different, right? In the winter, when the inversion is set in, some of my coworkers have done some modeling and show. So there is background ozone or ozone from other sources that's here. That's why ozone never goes to zero, except in Salt Lake when there's a really nasty inversion. So when things look clear, the background level of ozone is like 40 or 50 ppb. That's from sources mostly outside of the basin when we don't have an inversion. The background before the Industrial Revolution was like 20 ppb, so you can tell how much is extra. But that background gets lower in the winter because there's less sunlight. And the modeling that our team has done shows that, let's say we have higher background ozone when the inversion starts, then the first day or two of the inversion looks higher, but then as you go in after the first day or two, then the local ozone production kind of takes over, and you end up with the two scenarios merging to the same outcome after a couple of days. So it does have an impact mostly the first day or so when an inversion forms, and then it's mostly because the inversion pretty effectively traps and makes separate what's here. So that's basically the same as what you said, with more words.
No, much better. Thank you. Ricky.
Hi, Sheila. Thanks. One question. You noted about potentially losing highway funds. Can you tease that out a little bit more about what scenario would have to happen in order for the state to risk highway funds?
There's several ways, and I may ask my manager for a little help on this, but basically a couple ways. If we don't submit a SIP at all, if we just basically fail to submit a state implementation plan showing how we're going to attain the standard, I think it's a 12-month clock. I think about it. There's 12 or 18-month clock where EPA then will have to step in and they will develop a federal implementation plan for the state. But I'm not exactly sure when the when highway funds start to become at risk. I don't know, Becky, maybe sorry to put you on the spot. I haven't looked that far ahead because we're not going to get there.
Yeah, we're sort of, as you know, Ricky, dealing with this on the Wasatch Front right now. So we're having conversations with EPA, and we haven't had a really definitive answer so far. But it does have to do with a SIP disapproval. So they can take a part of your SIP and disapprove it and then decide to take highway funding at some point. And it has not been clear to us sort of what part of the SIP has to be disapproved in order to put what's called a conformity freeze or take highway funding. So we're getting answers to these questions from EPA right now.
In essence, I think, and maybe what you're trying, in essence, a lot of it comes to having control over your own fate is really, as a state, we really want to make sure we have a successful path forward. Because, as I mentioned, one of the other things is if they do disapprove your SIP, or if your SIP cannot show any kind of attainment, then it does become the federal government steps in and they will make a plan for you. But it's kind of interesting here when 80% of the emissions are actually under federal control already. But we definitely, as a state, want to make sure we own our own destiny rather than having someone else create that destiny for us. So,
I have a hard question maybe. So I feel like it's probably likely we'll be okay this December, but what happens if there's high ozone in February 2023?
yeah, that's a very interesting part of the Clean Air Act that I always struggle with a little bit, is ultimately if you get 3 years of clean data, I hate the word, you're golden. I mean, it basically, even if we will then have a huge event in late January, we will still have 3 years of clean data that will allow us, and I think it all has to do with the fact that it's a 2015 ozone standard. So we're trying to meet the 2015 ozone standard that EPA set up as a health standard. And if we have 3 years that show we have achieved that, we have met the 2015 ozone standard, the risk will come in is, and they are looking at this right now, is lowering that ozone standard. These NAAQS, we call them, National Ambient Air Quality Standards, are evaluated every 5 years. So they were evaluated in 2020, and they kept the ozone standard at 70 at that time. That has been challenged in court, lots of legal battles, and EPA is currently re-looking at the 2020 decision and potentially looking, they could potentially lower the ozone standard. And what that is, it starts the whole process over again. We will then look at our data and see, have we met the 2020 ozone standard if they change it? And then that will start the whole process over. And that's when we're at risk at that point. So it's going to be really dependent on meeting the standard this year and then what happens to the ozone standard in the next couple years. That. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you, and I'm here if you guys have any other questions, or you can always give us a call. And we have wonderful compliance folks here, too, that I know most of you know, so they can answer any questions.
Thank
Sorry to make this complex.
Thank you, Sheila. While we're switching over, our next presenter will be Dusty Monks with the Office of Energy Development.
All right, thank you. I appreciate this opportunity. I was here earlier this spring, and so this presentation is going to be basically 2.0 or part 2 of the carry on from the message I shared earlier. It's good to see a growing crowd here and appreciate John and Bart, their efforts to put together a good meeting with great information we received. It's been wonderful, and the great comments and questions. I echo the same. Thank Duchesne County. They're so supportive, and we see just a symptom of how they support us. They support the effort in the industry extremely well, and they're happy to do it. There's no grudgingly about it. They are more than happy and quick to volunteer. So it's really great. I know that the staff here is great behind the scenes, and Bart called them out and for their appreciation for them. And I know they got a busy day because they got Mike Lee coming this afternoon at 3 o'clock too, so it's going to be busy for them. So I introduced myself a little bit more detail last time I was here. I won't do too much of that this time just because it's boring stuff, and I don't like boring stuff. But just a quick information here from our office, those that are not aware. Our Office of Energy Development, we advance the governor's energy vision and implement this energy policy. So we work to enhance the energy infrastructure. We work through education. We work through market forces. We work through policy. And we have 3 pillars that guide our efforts. So these 3 pillars here, affordability, sustainability, or reliability, are what helps build up the energy plan that we put out here. I just updated here this last spring. I'm not going to go in detail about the plan. There's a lot of stuff there. If you want to look at it, you go to our website, which is UtahOED. I don't even know what it is. It's somewhere on the web. So if you just Google it, you'll find us. But it does have the plan. The points of the plan is that these 3 pillars, when you gauge against any energy source, in order for it to be supportive to Utah's priorities, you've got to check those boxes. And every time you look at different alternatives, different energies, traditionals, there is some point in this that there can be a challenge. And it's really important to make sure that you recognize, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, recognize these challenges and to address them and how we move the path forward. So today's I'm going to talk about the power of energy itself. It's a word play here, but I'm going to give you some examples. We're going to talk about this portion of it. So energy is defined as the capacity to do work. And right here you see an elderly couple harvesting. They're using the most ancient form of energy, and I call it breakfast. Calories, and that is improved. Calories have improved. The efficiencies of those calories improved greatly due to energy. And there's an author, expert on some energy and effects on civilization, named Václav Smil. I think I got that right. He has a good quote here, and unfortunately, I don't see my notes here. So this is going to be a challenge. So anyway, what he says, in 1900s, when a farmer held the reins of 6 horses, when he's farming, he controlled about 5 kilowatts of animate power. When a century later, his great-grandson sat high above the ground in an air-conditioned cab controlling about 250 kilowatts of diesel power. So amplifying those by introducing another energy source besides calorie, we're able to increase those efficiencies to meet the world food demand. So this is kind of the story that we're going to tell today. Here's an illustration. So the word play on this is the power of energy is the power at the rate at which work is done, and how that affects us, and how important that is, and how important it is to recognize that. So the power of energy surfaces in many aspects of our lives. It improves quality of life. This is kind of thrown back to what I had talked about earlier. It powers the quality of life, powers advancement, powers development, and powers security. So it's very important to recognize this portion of energy. The one thing that I will talk about, there's many examples here, and we can get into some pretty cool stuff, but for the sake of time, we're not getting to today. But the power of development is key here that I want to point out because it's very relevant to what's happening today in a lot of noise that we're hearing about energy transitions, about what's better, what's worse, what's going to be the new thing. There's a lot of confusion out there. And so if we boil it back to the sound principles to understand the dynamics of why we even have energy, what's the purpose of that energy, and what do we use it for, and why do we need it. And so when you look at the economic impact, that's a lot of conversation around it. So undoubtedly, the energy industry is a very key part of the economy directly, okay? But its power that it produces is greater because it drives the engine that drives the modern civilization that we enjoy. So what I'm trying to say is the indirect power of the industry is far greater than its direct impact, even though that's pretty impressive. When you do the math, just to give you some color on that, just directly, things that are measurable, the oil and gas, since we're oil and gas folks a lot here, their effect on the economy, on the economic indicators like employment multiplier, it's greater than 3, meaning for one job in the oil and gas industry, it affects more than 3, it induces more than 3 jobs. That's on the low end. It could be twice that high, but being conservative and the comparative is what's important, and that's greater than most other industries, just in the direct cause. The multiplier, what they use, okay, how effective to the GDP is that employee? The industry average, all of them is about 171,000 contribution to the GDP. Oil and gas is up to 371,000. So very significant impact directly, but it still pales in comparison to the indirect impact of our industry. So there's inside market forces, there's outside market forces. So being a part of the government, one thing that we definitely have daily questions is about the energy policy. Regulation, compliance, all this stuff is important to also lace in the understanding about those three pillars that uphold our civilization as far as the energy goes. It is very critical to the needs of any civilization, whether it's advanced or not, to have easy, accessible energy that's reliable, it's affordable, and the third pillar on that one is sustainable. So to even color that a little bit, I try not to be a boring statistics guy, because sometimes I get to be a data nerd. But I want to do a comparison here to help illustrate the indirect and indirect impacts. You guys have all heard of the Pony Express, right? This was a birth out of the need to get communications across the United States faster. And so in 1860s, they put together the Pony Express, and it started from what they had a big gap between Missouri and California, so they put together an express lane. Basically, if you were to liken it to what, trying to get Amazon packages at your house a little bit faster. So there's some interesting stuff on this I'll share just because I think it's cool and I like this kind of stuff. But so here was the advertisement when they went looking for people to sign up. This was the actual advertisement. So luckily I don't fit any of those. But there were sound reasons for that. And I don't know if that would fly today in today's advertisement. Gotta love the orphans preferred. That was their way of liability mitigation, right? So anyway, some interesting facts about this is pretty cool. Is that there was about 80 riders that were assigned to this, and they only really lost about, I say only, but they lost four other people, and they say it's questionable whether they lost that. But the station masters lost more. They lost 16 because they were sitting ducks, and they had good horses, so they were took out like sitting ducks. But they were paying these young kids. The youngest was 11 years old, and a lot had to do with they didn't want their moms to have to work. And so they thought they could be a man to provide for their family and bring home some bacon. And so a lot of them signed up for that reason. They would travel. The routes was 1,900 miles. The routes were about 70 to 100 miles long. And the average route the actual rider would take trip would be about 180 miles a day. They change out horses every 10 to 15 miles. The record was about 200 or 380 miles in one stretch with lots of horses and one rider but a lot of horses. Pretty cool stuff because at that time they were running right through the middle of the war with the Native Americans at that time. So some of the cool things about that too is are interesting is they were making about $125 a month. That was about $4,500 in our terms, or $4,500 a month in our dollars now. They wanted this is where the notes help. Sorry. These writers or this company only lasted about 19 months, about 2 years. It failed and never made a dime. It cost about $150 in our dollars to mail a letter early on. It finally got down to $30 a letter, but it wasn't sustainable. They killed some people, got some love letters delivered, but at the end of the day, with the government subsidies and everything, it failed. And then technology came along and took place of that. And so to contrast this to what the power of energy has, I like to bring out the obvious. So FedEx, Federal Express, it's great grandson of the Pony Express. sitting high above the ground in an air-conditioned cabin. They deliver 16 million packages a day, $22 billion in their operations, 500,000 direct employees, 16.5 million indirect. Significant difference, and that's powered because of fuel, because of energy, all made possible. That's why this is important to understand the power of energy, okay? And when you can get those three pillars in place, you know, we can make things happen. Now, if we don't have those three pillars in place, there's things and effects that negatively impacts other places in our environment. But the power of energy is important, and so that's why we need to focus on not only the direct impacts of what we're doing, but the indirect impacts of what we do. I'd like to have a controversial question here. What is the cost of getting it wrong? What if we fail to meet those three requirements? What if we take out one of those pillars? What effect does that have? What is the cost of getting it wrong? Well, we could speculate. I got some ideas. But unfortunately, we have a good example of some mistakes that was made that put Germany and Europe in some pretty bad situation. Germany, as you well know, was wanting to be, we can just use them as an example because they've made some mistakes. They wanted to be the leaders. They let their ambition overrun reality, and they wanted to be the leaders in the energy transition. And so they started cutting off all their traditional fuels, even nuclear. And what that opened them to was some great vulnerabilities. Before, and as y'all know, it's Ukraine and Russia, right? That was one of the biggest problems that they came in, but that wasn't the only problem. They had rising energy costs that were starting to escalate because they weren't balancing the supply and demand side of the energy. You know, regardless of what you feel the traditional side is, and with the effects of it, sometimes you can cut your nose off to spite your face, and that's what they did. And so, what does that look like? This is just from yesterday's graph that I got, and I didn't want to convert it from the euros because right now it's pretty well par. So you just take the E and put a dollar sign there, and it's close enough. So this is wholesale prices for electricity over there. So a year ago, and it shows here in the graph, and I'm sorry, it's light. But that graph starts in July of 2021. Back when I read a report just prior to July 2020, and they were complaining about prices, and they were saying, hey, we're vulnerable. Hey, we've got these risks. We need to pull back and understand where we're headed. Enter Ukraine, and you see the trend happen after Russia decided to play energy god with the throttle and the natural gas. And so their prices for electricity, this is wholesale prices. And you can see that they have tripled, doubled at times, and quadrupled. It got out of control. To compare what that looks like, a coffee shop they compared it to was $2,000 a month. Now it's $7,000. How can small businesses operate with that? Now that's a business. How can widow grandma, take care of her fixed income if her electric bill is now tripled? She's got to stay warm. So this is important to recognize. Just a comparative. This is what our wholesale. This is just a recent graph of wholesale, both gas and electricity for the United States. This is what we enjoy. We've hit above 100 a little bit, but we're down below 100. We got a trajectory that's showing a little bit of increase, and there's a lot of influences for that. So we can learn lessons from Germany, all of Europe, and not get over our skis on this. And I think it's important to make sure that we're cognizant of this effort at the state level. It's as important and more so right now in the federal. Some headlines. This is one of the most trusted sources, CNN, right? The only reason I use this is because it's like, man, if they see it, wow, you know. So they're hurting over there. 85% of the car makers view the country as an uncompetitive location because of high energy prices and increased insecure supply. So their economy is being devastated right now, and if it lasts much longer, it's going to have lasting effects. And it's all about, and so when we talk about the power of energy, and especially when it comes to policy, and I'm talking about corporate policy, I'm talking about government policy, I'm talking about personal policy. When it comes to that, we need to recognize that what we do is actually pretty important. Pretty important in direct work, but really important indirectly because we're powering the modern civilization. And if you want to, I won't go down that. That's scary stuff. But if you want to, you can talk to me about it after. But anyway, they have they have some hard questions, and we have the same questions that are coming. We're not going to avoid that. We can learn from it, but we have hard questions. We gotta make sure that we account for that because I can give you a few examples, just simple examples, because people will, prioritize life and livelihood above anything else when it comes down to it, and you start having unintended consequences. So, a little fun slide here for trying to shake it back up to bring everybody back up. Anybody's a Marvel fan? My daughter is, so I did this for her. With great power comes great responsibility. So what can we do? We can complain about what's out of our control and try to make adjustments or try to help make adjustments there. But what do we have within our power? So at OED, we asked this question. Some of the things, and there's a lot of issues that are affecting right now are affecting us. And today's theme is air quality. What is OED doing about today's theme? So we got two programs we're working on, just barely starting. One, we're trying to partner. We're working to get some grants to partner on the air quality. Dr. Lyman had talked about the aerial stuff, aerial leak detection. So we're trying to get some monies to help support that program. We also have the state energy program housed under our office, and that program we're trying to develop an air emission support for that, and we've been soliciting ideas for that so we can put together some monies to support that as well. So what can I encourage everybody to do? Well, do what you have within your power. We can recognize the challenge we have, adapt, and move. That's what the oil and gas industry has done from day one, and they've done a terrific job at that, to make sure that we have a sustainable energy source and that it can thrive and continue to fuel the great things it's been fueling. So with that, any questions? There's my contact information. It's break time after me, so.
Any questions for Dusty? Okay, not seeing any. Let's give him a big hand of applause. Okay, that brings us to our break. So let's go ahead and take a 20-minute break, which will mean coming back here at 10:50, and we'll look forward to hearing from the Utah Petroleum Association. Testing, testing. And we won't. Testing, testing. Awesome. Okay, everybody, if we can get you to start taking your seats, we'll start to get started. Okay, our next speaker will be the Utah Petroleum Association, and this will be a panel discussion on the Petroleum Association's Latch the Hatch campaign. And with that, I will turn it over to Ricky to get us started.
Hello, everyone. Can you guys hear me okay? Is that working? Perfect. Well, I want to start the same as everyone else in expressing my sincere gratitude to Duchesne County and to the Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining for hosting us today. We're lucky to have such great friends and supporters. I also want to thank the presenters that came before us because they made our job a lot easier. This is our second year of our Latch the Hatch kickoff, so this will be our second winter going into it. And, you know, the first year we had to do a lot of work in trying to explain the science behind ozone and the regulatory perspective. We're going to do a really quick refresher of that, but I think it was covered really well today. So I'm going to jump right in and talk a little bit about our Latch the Hatch program. This really is an initiative that takes the cooperation of all of us, all of our operators, all of our haulers. All of us have a role to play in making sure that the basin remains friendly for our industry to do business from a regulatory perspective. And this thing is really touchy. Okay. So I'm going to jump right into it today, and we're going to have the dream team over here that's going to actually do most of the talking. I'm just going to give you a high-level overview, but these guys are the boots on the ground that actually implement everything that we're talking about. So I'm going to start. I need to stand up so I can see this. And explain a little bit what Sheila Vance from DAQ already did. So I'm going to focus on the graph for the moment. So those red dashed lines, as Sheila said, those are the ozone standards that we are trying to attain, the 2008 standard and then our lower 2015 standard. Right now, EPA is reviewing potentially lowering the standard. We'll know next year, most likely. So that could go down as low as 67 or lower. And so, as Sheila said, the way that this works is we kind of get 3 free days a year. The standard is based on your 4th high. So they throw out your worst 3 days, and you have your 4th high. So what we did is we went back and looked annually at what those 4th highs look like. The green you can see at the bottom are years where we don't have snow, and it makes a huge difference. As Dr. Lyman talked about, that's not all of the issue, but it certainly is a really big impacting factor. And then the design value, which is kind of how we compare to those red bars, whether we meet the standard or not, is the 3-year average. So the 3-year average of the 4th high, not at all confusing. The thing I really want to stress here is right now, our 3-year average, which is what sets the design value, does show attainment of the standard, as Sheila had mentioned. What I also really want to stress, though, is that we don't know where that future ozone standard is going. And as you can see, if it drops lower, 3 ppb or even more lower, it's going to be really, really challenging to meet that standard. We also know that redesignation, so if we have a clean winter this year, if we make it through December, we don't have an exceedance, redesignation to attaining the standard is a multi-year process. I hope we're golden. That would be great. But this EPA has been, I will say, inconsistent in decision-making at best. And there's a lot of question marks about what would happen. It was a great question. What happens if before we're redesignated, we have another exceedance of the standard? And there's not a good answer to that, but it's certainly a risk. And so what I really want to stress, and what these guys are going to stress today, is the commitment that we as operators have and need to continue to have to reducing emissions, some ways to do that and why it's so critically important, not just for this year, but to allow the basin to continue to grow. So Dr. Lyman showed a very similar graph to this, but what you're seeing here, the gold line across the top is gas production, the dark line on the bottom is oil production, the red line is the ozone design value. Oil production and the ozone design value are not really correlating with one another, nor have they in the past. Gas production certainly was. So it's a good question of, if you look at this graph, what do you think happened in 2017 to have these two, the ozone design value and the gas production, diverge? Anybody have any ideas? Well, one thing that might be coming into play here is some new regulatory requirements that came into line, the permit by rule, for example, which drove down emissions. We're thinking that may have had a role here. The other thing that is changing is how we drill wells in the basin. So longer laterals, less surface facilities for the same amount of production or more, so less emission points. So our entire goal with the Latch the Hatch program is really to make sure that those lines stay separated. We need to decouple our emissions from our production growth. And so if you get nothing else from today, take that away, as that is our number one objective, is to decouple emissions from production growth. So I'm going to turn the time over to Lynn, who's going to talk about the program a little bit more, why it matters, and some of the things we're doing, and then and let me introduce these guys. So we have Lynn from Finley Resources, UNOX. We've got Dawn from Ovintiv, and we've got Jerry from Caris. I'm going to turn the time over to Lynn.
Alrighty, so Dusty, they did not have a job posting that said you had to be skinny and wiry to work here. Just so you know. Consider myself more stout. So I'm going to be a little bit selfish and stick with me for a minute, but here in about 8-9 weeks, I'm really excited about this, but I'm going to have my first grandkid. So little girl coming. Pretty excited. So you may say, what does that have to do with what we're talking about? Read the first line here. Effective ongoing non-attainment on the industry. So who is the industry? That's us. That's me. That's you. That's my soon-to-be granddaughter, right? She depends on me. Pre-birth, she'll depend on me post-birth. I don't shower her parents with money and gifts. They're adults. They can make it on their own, but it's probably a good idea for Grandpa to be somewhat stable and secure in his life, right? So think about the circles you guys have out there. Think about how far-reaching your effect is to relatives, aging parents, grandparents, etc. Pretty serious thing, right? Pretty good weight on our shoulders. So a couple of things I want to point out here. We heard Seth talk about modeling and coming up with numbers, the difficulties that are presented by weather and terrain conditions for the basin. Not easy, is it, Seth? We heard Sheila talk about the state having to come up with the SIP with plans to meet those shaky numbers that come from those models, right? So what does that mean for us as producers, as production companies? That means that we've got to be proactive. We've got to take the approach of creating a buffer. I don't want to bump the model numbers from these X and Y axes that I don't understand. I don't want Sheila and her team to come out and put regulations on me that make my job harder or ultimately mean my job, right? So couple of things that we really need to be cognizant to. Depending on the regulations, the changes, the rules that are pushed on us, we could add months to project lead times. We could fall into some of the offset requirements, which I'm not going to stand here and lie to you and tell you I understand the offsets any more than I understand this. If I want to go set a pumping unit, I want to go put a motor out there or an engine, let's say. If I'm going to create a pound of VOCs, I've got to reduce those VOCs by the factor of 1.1 or 1.2 somewhere else, depending on that attainment status, right? So that's tricky. That's very tricky. Could really restrict our industry growth, could really restrict the opportunities. You know, I'm a long-time basin resident, born and bred, been here my whole life. I hate seeing my kids grow up and have to leave for work. This is a big industry. We are a big industry. And ultimately, at some point, cost of regulation, cost of doing business could definitely impact the overall appeal of the basin to companies like Uinta Wax and Finley that I work for, wanting to invest their dollars here. Do I got to push the button? Okay. Wrong way. There you go. So on to a little bit more of, I guess, what we heard Sheila speak to, and Dusty as well, is looking at those opportunities, right? Where are the wins? Is it going after NOx? Is it going after VOCs? We kind of heard that VOCs are the low-hanging fruit and the wins for our industry, for us as operators and producers. So you can see the big red section here, the glaring section that says tanks, 27.2%. I heard another number come out. I think it was Dusty that said something about finding a 15% reduction. Maybe it was Sheila. Was it Sheila? All right, sorry. So studies done by Utah State, by other independent contractors have shown us that almost 15% of those numbers come directly from thief hatches. And that's kind of what started this Latch the Hatch initiative, right? So there's our 15%. That's the low-hanging fruit. Making sure that our hatches are closed, that's a big deal. That's where we started last year. I would like to feel that we've come leaps and bounds in that area. Latching the hatch, getting our crude haulers, our water haulers, our service companies to understand the importance of just shut the thing, right? Make sure that it's locked. The next piece comes from us as producers and from those same vendors. We've got to have the participation in making sure that those controls are effective. We got to make sure that we upkeep our maintenance. We got to make sure that we don't, and I don't know if we have any trucking companies here, but I see this little teeny slice that says 1.1%. I don't want to be the mean guy, but I also don't want to let the trucking companies walk out feeling like, man, I'm only 1% of the problem. Because guess what you do every day? You manipulate valves, you open hatches on my tanks. So we're partners in this. We've got to make sure that we're both doing the right thing. We got to keep those sealing surfaces clean, maintained. We need people to speak up and let us know when they see something out of place, right? It's a partnership effort. And then we look on to things like fugitives that were spoken about. Obviously, there's a lot of opportunities in fugitives, but primarily the focus we want to put out there today is that huge piece of the pie, which are our tanks, our tank controls, and our thief hatches. Don?
I appreciate that. And then the introduction from Ricky just a minute ago. I guess flipping to the next slide, I only have a couple here to cover, but this is a good segue, and it feels like the whole discussion this morning's queuing this up for us to come in and be excited about the things that we are doing as industry to make an impact, I guess, here in the basin. And specifically, Lynn covered it pretty well. This is the second year that we've initiated the program that we're effectively calling Latch the Hatch. It is a volunteer program from operators primarily, but it's not exclusive to operators. Anybody that's a UPA member can participate in this program. We encourage you to kind of come talk to us, any of us, as to how to get involved and make an impact, I guess, so that we can continue to curve that impact, grow production, and reduce emissions. I think that sustainable development kind of comes to mind. So. With that, we'll talk about just a little bit more on the next slide as to specifically how we're doing these things or meeting those things and what we're looking at beyond that. So the minimal expectations are closing the hatches, but there's a lot more. When you talk about the slides that Seth had from a few years ago for Quad O and Quad OA applicability, and you see the trend, dive down that correlated to the gas, production. At the same time, there are a lot of companies independent of one another that were taking voluntary actions to impact emissions in a really proactive way. What we didn't do a great job at is coalescing those things as an entire group. I think, kind of a shameless plug for Ricky and what she's done with UPA is she's really put us together as upstream operators to share best technologies, best practices in how we apply these things. And we're really seeing, that come to fruition, I guess, in some of the initiatives coming out. So a few of the things, well, I think that it's supposed to play through. Maybe we'll see if it does. And if it doesn't, it's probably like most things, just going to work as it works out here. So a really busy slide. The intention of the slide is to kind of pull it up so that you have a visual, I guess, as to what those things are. First, we are active volunteers of this program. We've got commitments from the highest level pieces of our companies. That's COs, that's CEOs, that's VPs. So their expectations, not us field guys that live here that are trying to make an impact to our families, but it's really a commitment from the companies that oversee the day-to-day, operations, make decisions that drive the direction of our overall organizations. We talk about trying to get the word out and message these things to people that aren't necessarily in this discussion, in the discussions that we have around emissions day to day. So we do this with signage. We put signage on our locations around hatches and those type of things. There are some hard hat stickers and some pamphlets to help remind those folks that are in the field. We encourage you guys to take these and know that when Seth sends a voluntary action for upcoming ozone challenges, we take that to heart. That's something we share with our companies and our contractors to try and curb those high ozone potential events. So signage exists out throughout the field. You'll see them on most of all of our locations. We continue to progress that, and the stickers are a great example today. The most recent, type of hatches that we're seeing success with that, are really extend the longevity and the maintenance intervals that we have for failure points of these tanks when they're open consistently or when they get a little bit of oil on them. We've almost installed 4,000 of those type of hatch gaskets. We're piloting new technologies in the way of alarms so that even where we have telemetry on these tanks, where we can see from our offices or locations, corporate office, type spots, when hatches are open. And when they're open more than the length of time for a typical oil cell or somebody to gauge a tank, it just cues us to go and take action and get that thing closed or be able to make a repair there. We've got good participation from hauling companies committed through contracts to also stand up efforts to train drivers to make sure that they know that they have an impact on the ozone here in the Uinta Basin, that it affects their livelihood or has that high potential to in the way that we operate. LACT unit is a lease accounting custody transfer. It's really a skid that allows us as a form of technology to be able to sell oil to oil hauling companies without ever having to open up and emit any emissions from a tank through the hatches. Isolation valves, so that we're not blowing down complete tank batteries, that we're only emitting the headspace of the tanks when we need to gauge that thing. So these are all things that we've taken as voluntary controls to either meet the current standards or exceed them in most cases. So again, we look to grow the group and want to talk a little bit about more that we're doing. And I think at the end, Ricky will have some of those things that we're excited to continue that evolution and push this so that we can have a lasting impact. The last one, and a good segue, is a flyover effort to utilize and advance the most recent technology that exists and see a lot of sites. Jerry's going to talk a little bit about the flyover that took place fairly recently in the Uinta Basin, the impact there, where we've seen leaks and how it's affecting decisions that we make kind of going forward to help this. So again, appreciate the time.
Yeah, I'm Jerry with Karis. I'm the air compliance lead. Just a segue, you'd be happy to know, Ricky, we operate in Western Colorado too, and I've seen the latch the hatch signage and metrics because we ordered so many here have drifted into Colorado as well. So you see lots of these signages on tanks and peons as well. And I think the agency over there has noticed it too. But I'm going to talk about the flyovers and what those are actually. So these are essentially aerial methane surveys. So you have, it's not even all that new, truthfully. I mean, it's new in the last handful of years, but it's new in terms of our industry using it as an effective tool to diagnose and find not just leaks, but it's, I hate to call them leaks all the time. They're emission signatures essentially, because you have a lot of activity that might be permitted that you're allowed to vent X amount of gas, and so you can actually see that as well. In terms of flyovers, there's essentially there's satellite technology, and there's aerial surveys that have planes, helicopters, and then drones. So there's a variety of different aerial tools you can use to look at your fly over your asset essentially. In terms of flyovers, so we've dealt with multiple vendors. Some of them fly at 10,000 feet above ground level, some at 3,000 feet above ground level, and the one more recently that we teamed up with flies at 700 to 800 feet above ground level. So if you think about that in terms of, the closer you get to the ground, essentially, it's not a direct correlation, but you can see smaller and smaller emission sources. So if you went, say you use a satellite, you can see basin-wide emissions. Or then you go to like something that flies at 10,000 feet, you can see, basin-wide, but also facility-wide emissions. And as you lower down closer to the ground, drones or planes that fly to 700 feet, you can see individual emission points at a facility with plus or minus 1 meter or so of resolution. So it's really been pretty impressive. I mean, I love my job and all, but like the flyover stuff has been really interesting in the last 2 years or so. We started looking at it. We flew in the Uinta Basin last May, our first pilot, and it was quite eye-opening. And so we were able to convince the people with the wallets over there in Denver to open them up and fund a couple of other flyovers. And we did one last fall, which flew at pretty high level, and we were able to diagnose a couple of interesting emission events. Pipelines and a few other things. But then this year we teamed up with several other operators, I think 4 operators total, or maybe 5, to kind of go in on a group pricing fee. These flyovers can be very expensive, and it costs a lot of money to mobilize and demobilize a plane and all that. So we teamed up in the last literally 2 weeks essentially to complete a flyover with one of our well-known, renowned vendors that Seth may have mentioned. But in terms of what is the advantage of a flyover? Karis, we have like 16 or 1,700 locations. So if you do the math, we have 2 LDAR techs. And if they worked year-round, including weekends, and weren't allowed to go hunting, they could probably do every facility once in a year. This flyover, we just completed it. They flew over our asset. I'm not even sure if it was multiple. They flew all of us in X amount of days, but I know they flew over us 6 days, and they looked at every single one of our facilities. I have sifted through, we're waiting for one more report, but I sifted through 450 separate emissions signatures that I had to look at and try to figure out, okay, what's going on here? So in addition to the flyovers and what they see here, you can see on this map here, kind of like what they send us is a snapshot of the facility with essentially a hotspot or some sort of event, whether it be in parts per million or SCFs per hour. But they just send us the data. Then I have to send my guys out in the field to go ground truth these. So if you think of that, we have 450 events. I'm like, there's no way in hell we're going to send out our guys to 450 locations in a matter of a week and look at these. So we'll get to the next few slides, but that didn't actually happen because we were able to see some interesting things in our flyovers that helped alleviate that need to go to every site. So let's see, I'm not sure. I think the next page has a few videos, and I'm not trusting this is going to work that well. But what I'm going to show on the next page is something I've shared at, I think, the Energy Summit as well, but 2 different scenarios where a flyover spotted both an issue on our pad itself that we verified was one of our issues, a flow line leak, and then another one where it's found something much larger on a third-party gathering line, a couple 100 yards or 100 feet actually off of our pad that we went out to the field to verify. So this is, did I press it one more time, you think? There we go. So this is on the ground looking at trying to find a leak that was seen on a survey. So down near the ground, about in front of the separators, it's hard to see, but you'll see some sort of vapors coming out of the ground. So what basically that showed was that we were able to verify we had an underground flow line leak on our pad. So when we see that happen, we shut in the facility, and essentially we have to fix it and dig up the ground and replace the piping before we can turn that well on again. The next one was much more substantial. Stop. Yeah, there we go. This one, you'll see, this is in the middle of a field. And you might get to see me walking through the plume just for fun. But our LDAR tech was out there, and he's like, wait a second, let's go look at this again. So we actually went to this location 3 different times. The operators did, and we're like, I don't see anything. Tanks aren't venting, nothing. So I said, let's go out one more time, and let's look around the edge of the pad. And we went out and looked past the sales meter, and sure enough, he's like, wait, I think I see something coming from the ground. So we verified that the flyover, what it saw was legit. And we have no idea of quantifying how much or how long it was there, but the third party implied that it might have been there for a while. Let's put it that way. Let's see, what's next? So I wanted to share some of the results from the more recent flyover, which is literally, I'm still waiting on 1 or 2 reports to come in. So this particular signature came out the first day, one of the first ones I looked at. And I'm like, that looks a little interesting. There's something coming from in front of the facility. And our techs went out and found out that there was a substantial discovered line leak underneath the road. And you could see, gas coming out of both sides of the road. And so we basically had to shut in that facility, and we're not sure if we're in the process of excavating it now. I'm renovating my house, but I think we're in the process of excavating it. So we had to shut it in to find and fix it. The second one is a similar signature that we saw off the northeast side of this pad. And I'm like, okay, this looks like either some sort of a idling truck or something else. So we had our LDAR guy go out, and sure enough, he found you'll see the hole in the ground there. There was another line leak that had kind of migrated to the surface, and it was pretty substantial in terms of what you saw off the FLIR camera. So I guess another part, when I first started doing the flyover stuff, or like looking at the results, it was, what percentage of these are legit, like actual emissions events? And talking to our LDAR guys this past week, I think it's safe to say 95% of what we see from the flyovers and we go out in the field and look at is legit. It's something that's actually there. It's not like a transient, idling truck or something like that. So we follow up on all of these. It's pretty legitimate. This one is another that we found last week, and we found a handful of these as well. It's a clear emission signature from the actual wellhead on the pad. So we went out there, and sure enough, there was a ball valve that was leaking pretty consistently. So, as it goes without saying in theory, I guess, but when we find these events, we go out and address them as soon as we find them, or as soon as we have the people to go out and address them and find them and fix it. But this was fixed within hours of the guy going out to look at it. Actually, it was probably fixed within minutes if it was just a ball valve. This was another really unique one because I knew this is a tank battery. And I saw this initially. I'm like, oh, maybe that's an open thief hatch. We can just have someone go out and close it. But upon further inspection, they went out there and the combustor wasn't running very effectively. So they've done some. I think they're out there today actually looking at it, and they think it's not. I think I said it's a flame arrestor. I got corrected on that this morning at 7 a.m. It's more like the flow line is clogged with rust and debris. That's what they think it is. So we're going to go out there with a vac truck and just blow it out, and we can fix it. But something like that we may not have seen because it's not on our normal LDAR route, or we might do it once a year. But this was something we saw with the flyover and verified and are actively fixing. Oh, yeah, this one. This is actually, there's nothing all that's shocking about this one other than what's on the far left, but it's not that shocking. So at compressor facilities, you have very large horsepower. I think this facility has like maybe 20,000 horsepower or something like that. But you have multiple natural gas-fired reciprocating engines or compressor engines. So what you're seeing from the units on both the north side and also on the further south side are likely either rod packing emissions, possibly some fuel gas slippage. We're not sure exactly. It's hard to quantify that. But on the far west, you look on the far west side, I saw that. I'm like, that's kind of strange. And so we had one of our guys go out there and look at it. And sure enough, it was another buried line on the edge of the road on the pad. That was basically just, you could see gas coming out of the ground. And so that was, I think they're actively fixing that as well. We're actively fixing all of these, except for what I'm about to show you next. This was one, I saw this initially and I'm like, uh-oh, this could be bad. But what really happened was that I verified with the field. I'm like, hey, when do we start winter operations? Which winter operations essentially is you need to run heat trace pumps essentially to route glycol around your facility to prevent from freezing up. So we started all of our wintertime operations about a week before this flyover happened. And so of the 450 or so sites that I've looked at so far, at least 80% of them are what you're seeing are gas actuated heat trace pumps. And that actuation gas, you can see it. I told our CFO this, and he's like, you can see that from space? I'm like, actually, this is just from like 700 feet above the ground. but I'm like, yeah, from space, you can see them. You send us more money to fix these. But this was really eye-opening to me. I didn't expect to see this signature on literally 80% of the sites I've seen so far, maybe more than that. But as a result of that, I looked at these, and you can kind of sift through them, and about 80% of them we didn't even have to go out and look at because I'm like, yep, that's a trace pump, that's a Leon pump, or whatever it might be. So that was really revealing from the flyover. I mean, we've known about that, and it is part of one of our, to plug some recent efforts we've done. We're replacing some of these pumps, and we do have a few thousand of them, by the way. And I'm assuming other operators do as well, because we're all in the same basin where it gets super cold and we're trying not to freeze stuff. But we're piloting a project to replace a few hundred of these with solar powered pumps. And now we're just worried how they might run if we get a big snowfall and then inversion for 2 or 3 weeks. We'll see what happens. But the next slide I definitely didn't read. So what's missing, I guess, from latch to hatch? What other things can we discuss, essentially? And I think we're going to open the floor to some degree in terms of what are other operators doing. I would say for us, we do a lot of voluntary leak detection and repair. We've looked at electrification. It's not all that viable in certain areas of the basin, at least not for us. But we do operate quite a bit of electric compression in the field already. Yeah.
You've got this great little flyer in front of you here with a list of things that we encourage folks to do, that we encourage our members to do. I would just ask, any other thoughts? Anything we're missing? Anything you guys are doing? Anything more that we should be doing?
Or any questions, I guess.
What is the feasibility of doing this drone monitoring? Is it really costly or,
Feasibility?
well,
Or
as
visi-
far as economics and, Jerry, can you repeat the question? Sorry.
She's asking about the economics or feasibility of doing some of these surveys in terms of. Sure. Yeah. Basically, what's the cost? How feasible is it to do? I can say there's wide-ranging cost differences depending on how low you want to fly. We haven't done the drone stuff yet. We're looking at options to do that just specific for us for our flow lines. We have 1,000 miles of pipeline and flow line across our basin that's Caris owned, so it behooves us to do that. The drone stuff isn't super expensive, but some of the flyover stuff that we recently did is not cheap. It's a lot of money. But also, because you spend so much money on it, it behooves you to find, when you see things and find them, or chronic things like the pneumatic pumps, it behooves you to address those. Where are your low-hanging fruit? And it's obvious for us anyway, what's the low-hanging fruit. So. Jerry, I'd say the same thing, or very similar. For different companies, it may be a different answer. Definitely, we find commonalities and we communicate those things, like I mentioned, best practices and technology. For us, we're also seeking out opportunities where we can commingle sites into bigger locations where we can economically gather, gas off of tanks with a technology that's a vapor recovery compressor to take that from low pressure at the tank level and find value in it. At the same time, we're not emitting it to send it down the gas line, in that way. So commingling, VRTs, VRUs, those are a couple other examples. Electrifying trace heated systems, those also are something I think more than a few of us are looking at or have implemented. Anything else you want to cover?
So a couple other things I might throw out there would be ramping up our efforts for maintenance activities, right? So engine maintenance, we hear about the fugitive or VOC emissions coming off of engines. Definitely laser focused on pre and post analyzer results on emissions based off of our engine maintenance programs. That would be something that I think we're probably all doing.
Anybody else out there have anything they want to share on this? We're open to ideas and suggestions either now, or you can contact me if you have some other ideas of what we could add here. I'm just going to close it really quickly here by thanking the folks that were part of our year one program. You can see all of them up on the screen. We know this year we've already got a few additional producers that basically puts us in position for coming into this winter to have the vast majority of production in the basin covered by this program. And as was pointed out, we call it Latch the Hatch, but it's really much, much more than just keeping thief hatches closed. There's a long list of actions that we ask all of our volunteer companies to take, and you can kind of cater that menu to things that look like they're going to be most effective and most doable for your company. You don't have to do everything on that list. I would just put in another pitch for USU's ozone alert program. That has been incredibly helpful. And I'd ask folks to really think about, if you know that there's an ozone event coming, what can you do? What can you do for those couple of days to really make the biggest difference in reducing emissions during that critical time period? But with that, I think that's all that we had to share, and happy to take any other questions.
Okay, thank you, Ricky, Lynn, Don, and Jerry. Appreciate you coming up and chatting with everybody. Okay, so we're about to the point of kind of an open discussion. I've got a couple things here in front of me to start out with. The first one being Kim Frost. Do you want to come introduce yourself really quickly to the group?
Sure, thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Kim Frost. I'm the Executive Director of UCARE, which is the Utah Clean Air Partnership. If you guys haven't met us before, we were formed 10 years ago, actually, by Governor Herbert. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, but we really have 3 missions, and that is public education. So we've done a lot of campaigns along the Wasatch Front to help educate the public there. And we really want to get more involved in the basin. We're obviously a statewide organization, and we work closely with the Division of Air Quality as well as DEQ. We're housed there. They're nice enough to give us space, but wanted to let you know that we're also a resource to you. We want to be a partner. We call ourselves the Big Tent because we bring everyone together to try to talk about practical solutions. We're not a policy organization. We're not out there lobbying. We really want to be a partner. So wanted to quickly introduce our organization and let you know that we also have a small grant program. So Seth is on our board, actually, and he serves on our grants committee. So they select the grants that we're going to award. They're typically around $20,000, so they're not a huge grant, but they are available to companies in the basin. And I'll tell you that we're excited that thanks to Seth's outreach here, 3 of the 9 applications that we moved forward are actually projects in the basin. So we're excited to get more involved out here and want to introduce ourselves and tell you that we're here. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then from the Uinta Basin Association of Government, Kevin Yak and David Russ, do you want to come up for just a moment? And I'm not sure if you have an order you prefer.
Hi, thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak with you for just a moment today. We want to thank all of you for being our partner. You may not know that you're our partner, but you are our partner. We are the Uinta Basin Association of Governments, and we serve the residents of Daggett, Duchesne, and Uinta counties. Most of you, throughout the years, have donated to our food pantries. So just wanted to publicly thank you from our board of directors, who are the mayors and county commissioners of the 3 counties, and especially the UPA and all of you throughout the years who have donated to our food pantries. Without you, the food pantries wouldn't have what they do, and we definitely punch above our weight. Throughout the state, we get tons and tons of food, and most of that's due to the industry and with what you all provide. So wanted to thank you for that. In addition to that, we also do economic development projects, and we are tasked with helping with some planning efforts in the region. The Governor's Office of Planning and Budget is facilitating planning efforts in our region, and this is through Envision Utah. And why this is important to you is for planning in the future. This is going to the to the state and to the governor for policy decisions in the future. So how we're going to use our natural resources, mineral extraction, things like that. So we have a survey that we have sent to Bart Kettle, and I'm going to let Dave talk a little bit more about the survey, what it includes, and why we need your assistance.
Thank you, Kevin. David with Uinta Basin Association of Governments. So the survey that Bart will send to you is just some basic economic information in regards to what you do in regards to the public, the energy side of things, the economics with that. So the more information that we can get from you as the public, the better it's going to be for the decision from the governor's office in providing some economic lift in regards to the area out here. But I think that's all we have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So now open it up to the group. Is there things that individuals from the group might want to cover or bring up while we're here?
First of all, thanks to everybody who's here. I'm Irene Hansen, Duchesne County Commissioner, and as you know, has been said before and is said many times, you know, the industry and all of the many layers of economic development that take place in the basin because of our industry is, of course, noteworthy, and it's our bread and butter, and we recognize that and appreciate it. Many of you have been involved, a lot of our production companies and a lot of our service companies, trucking companies, in the Enchanted Forest, where we have trees representing about 25 of our different charities in the basin. They're basin-wide. The money cannot go for administration, by the way, so that's good. 100% has to stay here in the basin. And that the bidders, so for those who want to come and bid or add money to a tree, some people say, well, gee, we can't do $3,000. Well, if you can do 300, come anyway, because you can add that to your favorite charity. But that is going to be Thursday, November 17th of 22. And so I have tickets here with me today. It's complimentary. And so we'd love to have your company represented. Come and enjoy that dinner. Enjoy seeing the camaraderie and the great work that is done with the charities. Speaking of the food pantry, they will have a tree there. And so, as will so many other really, really good basin charities. So we have tickets here. Come and ask me. We'd love to have you come, have your company there. It's an evening that you will not forget. It's full of pride and generosity, and it speaks to who we are. And we're certainly proud to be a part of that. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Irene. Other items? Should have just stayed back here.
Waited till you got to the front.
Hi, everyone. Ricky from UPA again. I just wanted to remind the group that we have two great contests that we have open right now. The first one is our nominations for our Environmental and Safety Awards. So you can nominate yourself, you can nominate another company, an individual. There's 3 different awards there for environmental and safety. All the details are on our webpage, and the award winners will be announced at our annual meeting on March 7th. And we also kicked off a new competition this year called Wildlife and Energy. And the idea is to try and find some visual examples of the fact that this is not a mutually exclusive concept. Wildlife tends to thrive around our facilities, and our operators and operations are actually great stewards. So I have to give New Mexico credit. We stole the idea from them. But if any of you are budding photographers out there, we would love to have you submit a photo for that contest. There are cash prizes for the first, second, and third place winners, and those will also be announced on March 7th at our annual meeting. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Ricky. I'm just going to stay on this side of the room this time just in case. Any other items? My diligence staying here paid off.
I'm Kirk Benj. I'm the director of the Tri-County Health Department, so we cover the same area as the Uinta Basin Association of Governments, Daggett, Duchesne, and Uinta counties. But I just wanted to say one thing at the very end, I guess, which is, I know we talk a lot about attainment, non-attainment, and EPA regulations and whatever, but at the end of the day, in my mind, it really boils down to healthy communities. All of these regulations are essentially in place so that we don't end up with kids going to the ER with asthma attacks in the winter when we have inversion days, right? And we don't have extra people having heart attacks because they're out shoveling snow and the air is bad. And so I'm not particularly motivated by the carrots and sticks that EPA puts out there. And unfortunately, oftentimes there's more sticks than carrots, right? But I am motivated by my friends and neighbors, and I want them to be healthy. And if I had one takeaway, it would be, let's work together. I really appreciate everything that's been shared today. I super appreciate the work that's being done to improve air quality. And just want to remind everybody why we do it at the end of the day. So thanks. Appreciate everybody here.
Okay, thank you. Any closing items? Okay, not seeing any. Just real quickly, I would like to go back through and thank a couple of people that made this all possible. Duchesne County for helping us with the morning break in the facility, Finley Resources, UNOWAX for providing lunch, and then if we could, just one last round of applause for our speakers, Seth Lyman with USU, Sheila Vance with Division of Air Quality, Dusty Monks with Office of Energy Development, and the Utah Petroleum Association and their panel. Like we said previously, they're all here kind of volunteering their time to prepare and present to get a better outcome. And so it's to help us as kind of a collaborative group and as a community get to the place we need to be. So maybe one more quick round of applause for everybody. Okay, and then on to the good news and the bad news. The good news is we might be able to go to lunch 15 minutes early. The bad news is, as of 10 minutes ago, it wasn't here. So we're not sure if it's here yet or not, but please stay and mingle for just a little bit and we'll get it sorted out.